Nicole Lee is a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert, as well as a leadership coach, a nationally recognized speaker, and strategist who regularly consults with nonprofits, schools, businesses, political, and social movements to help them improve the climate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is the founder of Inclusive Life and the co-founder of the Lee Bayard Group, the Black Movement Law Project, and for almost a decade, she served as president of Trans Africa. She worked with leaders across the globe to advocate for just and fair U.S. foreign policy. She has been a commentator on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and the BBC, and she has also given testimony in front of the United States Congress, the United Nations, as well as other international bodies. She's not only an attorney, but an intuitive coach. And through this unique blend of brains as well as spirit, she has contributed to movements across the United States and abroad to help bring human rights to the forefront. One of her proudest moments was working alongside civil rights icon Bill Lucey, who was the architect of the historic Memphis sanitation strike, for a national commemoration on the life of his good friend, Nelson Mandela. Welcome to The Lindsey Elmore Show, a podcast that helps you find fulfillment amidst chaos. On this show, I interview thought leaders, doctors, creatives, spiritual gurus, and game changers who inspire you to pursue your dreams, overcome obstacles, and leave your mark. Nicole Lee, welcome to the Lindsey Elmore Show.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so excited to talk to you today. So take us all the way back. You know, a lot of people are experienced with diversity, but you say that it's critically important to talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity all in the same conversation. Tell us why that is.
Right. Well, often I think that people put a lot on the word diversity. They think it means more than it actually means. Diversity really talks about the presence of folks of different races, gender, ability, right? So many different aspects. Almost often I think that my clients think of those old United Colors of Benetton commercials. Do you remember those ads?
Oh, yeah.
Many, many different colors, and also people of different races, all genders, like absolutely being expressed there. That's important. Presence is important, but it's merely presence. We have many institutions in our society that actually are pretty diverse and yet do not honor humanity, right? That don't really work towards making sure everyone has a vote. You think about our prisons, frankly. U.S. prisons are actually pretty diverse, and yet are those institutions that are that ensure that everyone's humanity is honored, that everyone has the right to be heard? We know that's not true. Absolutely not. So diversity is merely presence. It's really inclusion that we're thinking about when people say, oh my goodness, this is so great. It's such a diverse place. We're really talking about the fact that we feel inclusion. And inclusion is making sure that each and every person's interest, right, their identities are not only honored, but are brought in to the decision-making processes. So it's not that, oh, it's great that people of color are in the room, but people of color are also making the decisions, and they can make decisions based upon their needs of all the different aspects of their identities, not just being people of color, but perhaps there are women, right, in the room. Perhaps there are folks with different gender identities in the room, that we can bring our whole selves, and our whole selves will be honored, our whole selves will be heard, and that there's this understanding that when we do that, that actually makes society, that makes the table, that makes the community a better place. And so often I think when people say we really want to reach for diversity, I often tell them, like, let's first reach for inclusion. Let's make sure that even from where we're starting, this is a welcoming place that honors everyone. Equity is also a really important issue too. And folks juxtapose equity with equality. People say we all want to be equal, right? And I think we all want to have similar opportunities. But the truth of the matter is, we're actually not all starting from the same place, right? When we mention issues of food deserts or health inequities, right? Some of these things are historical, and some of them are historical, and the realities of that history are brought into our present day, right? So you may need more, if you will. Some folks may need less. Equity takes that into account. Equality states, you know what, if you have something, even if I don't need it, I should get it too, right? And that, we know that's not sustainable. The way that I like to describe equity is that when we're in an equitable situation, when our communities are equitable, every single person has what they need to be successful. And I think that that's really important. And I know that many people wish for these things, but don't have like the terminology or the understanding that these are actually issues that we can push forth in our society and in our communities.
So let's talk about, a lot of people, they don't want to consider themselves racist.
Yes.
But what I really talk to my audience a lot about is individual racism. I would hope is not as rampant now as it once was. But can you give us some examples of how we're not all starting from the same place? What are some of the things that are kind of just ingrained into our social fabric that many of us don't even see that lead to inequalities, which I'll ask you a follow-up question, but let's start there.
Right. So, humans are the smartest mammals on the planet. Maybe we're in a tie with whales, but we're pretty smart. And a part of that ability to discern what we need to do in order to survive, right, has to do actually with what our brains are capable of doing very quickly. Another term for that, another way of saying that in one word, is bias, right? We have the ability for bias. So we make these quick decisions, not even realizing it often that we're making decisions about whether or not we're safe, who we're around, are these people a part of my group? And it's evolutionary, right? So that, coupled with the fact that our society was built on some very specific things, and they're actually all not good. Right? We like to talk about that our society was built for freedom and it was built for democracy. But really, as a student of history, I know, frankly, that is not true. It wasn't built upon the freedom for everybody. It was built, frankly, for the freedom of white, cisgendered men who owned land. Right? And even as, like when we talk about diversity and inclusion, even as the country has grown and things have changed, we have to understand that actually the foundations and the underpinnings were only built to sustain the quote unquote humanity for very specific people. And so until we are really ready to excavate that, tell the truth about that, and tell the truth a lot and all the time, we're going to have a difficult situation and not perpetuating some of the same things we've been seeing in terms of racism. I often talk about that there are levels of racism, right? So we have internalized racism, right? And even people of color, Black and Indigenous people of color, experience internalized racism. Often it comes out in self-hate, right? These beliefs that we have from our society. Again, our bias also allows us to pick up different clues, like what's valued in society and what is not. And really our internalized system takes that in. So it might be things that we never say, but it might be in the choices that we make. We'll tell our children, go play with those children and not those children. And we maybe can't explain why our gut is telling us that. Sometimes there are, real things we have to consider, and sometimes it is bias. Sometimes it's racial bias. Then we have the interpersonal, and lately I've been describing interpersonal as, these conflicts we're seeing in social media, where someone will say something racist, right? That's the interpersonal, when we say something or do something to someone else, right? To another individual. Oftentimes that's the racism that everyone thinks about. Like, I don't do that. I don't use racial slurs, or I don't say things in social media that would be deemed racism. And yet there are a couple other levels too, right? There's institutional racism, right? There are ways in which we keep even our small businesses, right? We hire, quote unquote, who we know or who we're comfortable with. Yet so many of us are comfortable with people who look like us. right? And because we have a society where we have given privileges to folks in white skin, that might then mean our institutions look mostly white because of little decisions, little even unconscious and unintentional things that we have done. And then we turn around and say, oh my goodness, why isn't this place diverse? Really adding to that is the systemic racism. And it's when you look at all of our institutions together, right, and how they work together. So some people, since the killing of George Floyd have said, I have discovered all of these things about my country I didn't know. I watched Ava DuVernay's documentary 13. I've seen some things about the prison industrial complex. Well, the prison industrial complex, was not created overnight. It was created by a series of decisions over hundreds of years, quite frankly. And it also is not propped up by just one thing. Like people say, what's the one thing? It's systemic. So there's multiple actually systems and within those systems, institutions that prop that up. So this is why that excavation I've been talking about. As a young lawyer, I worked in South Africa and did some work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the purpose of that really was to tell the truth, like tell the whole truth of what has happened so we can understand where we're going next. Because it's really hard to come up with the solutions when we're still pretending, while we're still behaving as if we're not in the situation that we are in with race.
Absolutely. It's like my colleague who was on the show a few weeks ago said she hosts yoga retreats only for women of color. And I asked her, why did you choose to do that? And she said, because if you're going to get to true healing, you can't start with racism 101. You can't start by just like, hey, can we all acknowledge that this is a thing that goes beyond my own personal feelings? It goes into things that are unconscious, that have been ingrained in me over the course of generations. And it also just goes into all of the different ways that people are held back just generation after generation after generation. And right now, honestly, is a scary moment because a friend of mine said something which I called her out and I said, that's really sunshine and roses, but it's not reality. She said, well, if parents don't like the way that their children are being told that they have to go back to school this fall, well, they can just homeschool. And I was like, oh, honey, that assumes that there are two parents so that one can be a breadwinner and pay the bills and one can stay home and do homeschool. That also assumes that there was an educational background to where someone got out of at least high school, if not college. That makes a lot of assumptions, and we don't realize that, oh, wait a minute, by saying, oh, you can just homeschool, it devalues the struggles that people have been through. And it also just moves that starting line. If you're running a race, it moves a certain group of people ahead in that starting line. And so, the Black Lives Matter movement is everywhere right now. And I know a lot of people are skeptical. Like, is this truly to help police stop murdering Black people on the street? Is that really what we're after? Or is this donating to political campaigns that I may not be on board with that candidate? And so give us some background about the Black Lives Matter movement. What's been your experience, and what are some of the biggest misconceptions about Black Lives Matter? And perhaps what do you recommend that we could do that might even be more productive in our daily lives?
I love all of those questions, and I especially love the conversation around schools because it points to a really important concept that I also teach a lot about, which is intersectionality, right? So we can talk about race. We also have to talk about socioeconomics. We also have to talk about gender. So when we say, oh, just homeschool, who's the most likely person, right, in a family to have to do that, right?
The mom.
Like, the mom. So yeah. We're then asking the mom then to give up, right, income that she and the family may need. Also, it is this American dream picture often that we have, that we can survive on one income. Most families cannot survive on one income, regardless of race. But when you add race into it, there is this other aspect. There is this other aspect of not not being at that starting line, as you said. So there are statistics that talk about an African American, a Black person with a master's degree may make often as much as a white person with a high school diploma, right? With all the loans to prove it. I mean, so we have to really be thinking about, are these decisions so easy? But I love your question about the Black Lives Matter movement, and I have been honored to frankly serve that movement almost since its inception. Black Lives Matter as an organization was created by three amazing women who I am friends with: Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. And they created it after George Zimmerman was found not guilty of the killing of the young boy Trayvon Martin, which was a devastating blow to the Black community, to have a child that was basically stalked by an adult and then have people turn around and say it was the child's fault. For many Black folks, that was just such an obvious example of how no matter what, we will still be seen as the criminals, even though this was a child. I mean, if you imagine Trayvon Martin and then close your eyes and then imagine a white girl and what would have happened in that situation. It was just really devastating. And so Alicia actually put a message out on Facebook and said, "Our lives matter, Black Lives Matter." And it became a hashtag, and work was done around really this issue of human life and dignity. And not that, you hear people say all lives matter. Well, you know what? That's awesome. And it's also Black people that are being killed, often indiscriminately by police.
And I think that it became full focus for white people when we saw in Buffalo that 75-year-old white man walking down the street, peaceful protester, and just get pummeled by police. And me included, I was like, oh, how could they do that? And Black people are sitting back like, where y'all been? Like, we've been screaming this from the rafters for years.
Well, Lindsey, you don't know this, but I'm actually from Buffalo.
Are you?
And I am. And I know the elderly white gentleman I've met him over the years. And I haven't lived in Buffalo in a number of years, but he's been a peace activist for a very long time, right? Sweet person. And I think that that's a really good example, because one of the things that I learned, so I worked internationally for a number of years, and I really got involved as an attorney when Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson. I did work to support protesters and continue to do that. I really didn't, even though I worked in diversity, equity, inclusion, did not have a full understanding of how the police operate in the United States. And while our police departments are local, there are some threads that you see across the country. And so that treatment of that elderly white man was extremely telling. I was not surprised to see it, but I understand why people are surprised, because what we believe in this country is, well, if you cooperate with the police, you will be okay. If you do what they tell you, if you don't commit a crime. These are all not just stories that we believe as adults, they're literally the stories that we're told as children. And so when I was growing up, I would say, even though I grew up in an African-American home and family, there was this belief that, oh, when police brutality happens, it's either because the neighborhood you live in, or you're unlucky, right? Or you must have done something. In the last decade, what we've seen, though, because of technology, because we have our phones when something happens, right? We can videotape. What we've seen is actually you can completely cooperate and still be killed. Philando Castile. You can be home asleep in your bed, right? Breonna Taylor. You can be a child playing child games in a playground, Tamir Rice, and so many more things, and be killed. Commonly, what we're seeing, though, is it's Indigenous people and Black people that are experiencing this. But what happens when you allow a system to take it too far? That's what we're seeing in Buffalo. That's what we're seeing in Portland. That's what we're seeing in many cities. And this is not a partisan issue. This is an issue of how citizens can be expected to be treated by their government. Right? The police are an extension of the government. And so if you expect to be able to walk down the street without being slammed on the ground by the police, then one thing that I would suggest then is that you be about making sure that happens to no one. right? Because we're seeing it creep into other aspects of our society. If nothing else, even if you're just doing it for self-interest, it's time to act. And so, as you're asking the Black Lives Matter movement, that's really a big part of the movement. But there are other things too. We're thinking about the fact that there needs to be healthcare for all people. All people need, as you were talking about the health equity issues. Oh my gosh, people need to be able to know that they're going to be able to live, right? They're going to be able to get a living wage. They're going to be able to get, if their children are sick, they're going to be able to get the health care that they need for them. And so, yes, it is more than just police brutality. But remember, when we're talking about systems and institutions, it's this understanding that this isn't just personal tit for tat. This is about how we live our everyday lives, and that everyone should have those opportunities. And we know, because of racism, many, many, many Black folks and other people of color have not had those opportunities.
We do definitely need to have an open conversation. I think for white people, it's really hard because, I mean, come on, let's face it, when the system is rigged in your favor, it's kind of a nice position to be in. But when you take a step back and say it is the only humane thing to do, I've said for years that healthcare is a basic human right, and not just sick care, which is what we have in the United States. We need people to have access to fresh food at their neighborhood market that is affordable. It should not be expensive to feed your family a decent meal. It should not be to where a mom is working 3 and 4 and 5 jobs because the husband or the child has gotten sick, and now they're burdened with just hundreds of thousands of dollars of healthcare bills with nowhere to go. All of that breaks down ultimately the care of the child, which ultimately leads to children having the decision of, like, do I fall into this group that's going to take me in no matter what they're asking me to do? So you fall into patterns of either drug use or violence, or hopefully they've got an amazing teacher or an amazing person in their neighborhood or an amazing chef in a kitchen who says, come and cook, come and wash dishes, that gives an opportunity that helps children who maybe their parents are in that situation to help move them to a different place. And I want to go back to one of the things that you said, which was when you cooperate with the police, it's going to be okay. Well, if we saw any evidence in the past couple of years, you mentioned Ava DuVernay and her documentary 13th, which, friends, if you have not watched 13th, get ready for your life to change. But her documentary, her docudrama, When They See Us, that was one of the boys. His dad is just in there saying, just say you did it. Just say you did it. Just say you did it. And you watch the follow-up, after they have been exonerated and they have gone back to living whatever semblance of a lives that these boys and these men can now live. Now they look back and they say, had I just stuck with, I did not do this. I did not murder this woman. And so we do see breakdowns in if you don't obey the cops, that think bad things can still happen. Yeah?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that through Black Movement Law Project, we always talk about is no one, like, this is not your civic duty or your patriotic duty to talk to the police. Right? That is just not, it's not a good idea, in part because what we have to understand about what's happening in our police forces and what's being discussed is trickery, right? Even with children is par for the course. Right. So lying and saying, like, I don't know, such and such in the other room said that you did steal. And you're like, wait, I didn't steal. Oh, well, if you just say you did, I'll make sure everything works out for you. Right. Can you imagine being 10 years old, being 14 years old in a police station, and a police officer says, I can help you out. Right. I know you've been here 6 hours. I can help you out. Right. The things that we allow to go on. And that's a really good example of the exonerated 5 from New York. What happened to them? These are things, again, this doesn't happen just once. This isn't luck. This is a system. And this is how the system has allowed people to be treated. And there's a variety of reasons as to why. It's it allows for our education system to continue the way it is. It gives excuses for things like redlining and other policies. Politicians have played, frankly, all of us in this notion of the war on drugs, the war on crime. What we have to understand, though, is that these are ideas that were created by people, and they can be dismantled by people as well, right? And we are the people to dismantle it.
Well, that was my next question, is how do we break the back of it? If it's this entrenched and it's this many years, and it doesn't just go back. I know a lot of people, when they hear like, oh yeah, you're going to change the system, you're going to change the government, you're going to change prisons. It doesn't just go into our political and governmental systems. It goes way back beyond that, where when Black people were loaded onto slave ships in Africa, the only people that survived were the ones that had the ability to retain salt. And now we sit back and go, oh, Black people just have a higher incidence of hypertension. They just have a higher incidence of kidney disease. No. Because of the abuses of our ancestry, we genetically selected for some Black people to be at a disadvantage. And so where do we even start? Is it within healthcare? Is it within the legal system? Is it when who we vote for? What do we do to change this?
Right. I think that question is so important. It's actually the reason why I founded Inclusive Life, because we actually start with ourselves. Right. Oftentimes people will come to me and they'll say, we want to do these trainings in our organizations, so our organization's culture can change so we can be more diverse and inclusive. And I say, great. But then in that process, what people find is, wait, this is also an individual journey I need to be on. So I founded Inclusive Life so that we would have a place to talk about how we bring more inclusion, more equity, right, into our own lives. How do we make sure that we are acting anti-racist? How do we make sure that we're for gender equality? How do we make sure we don't fall for things like bathroom bills that really are trying to attack transgender people, but in the name of something else, right?
Or like some bars that say, oh, we just banned cornrows. It's like,
right,
come on, just say it. You don't want Black people in here. Just
right,
say it.
Exactly. How do we create these frameworks whereby we can live our lives? And it's, yes, absolutely, how we are individually and personally, internally. It's also how do we talk to our children, right? What are we saying within our families? How do we have those difficult conversations? What are we doing in our communities, right? Are we willing? It's one thing to say I'm anti-racist, but it's another thing to go to people who are in our community or in our family, like our everyone seems to have this racist uncle. Like, what are you able to say? And not just yelling at the person, but how do you get into dialogue and engage? And then, of course, how does that impact society? How are we impacting society? Not just one person at a time, but how are we amplifying our reach? And so I often tell people, getting oneself involved in community that is committed to anti-racism, that might be an organization, that might be that you're doing things virtually right now because of what's happening in our country with coronavirus, but get involved in community. And not just to be kind of a lurker, right? To just be educated, but how do you create ways to be accountable to that community? So lots of folks say that they're living in suburbs. Like I'll use Portland as an example. Oh, I don't live in Portland. I live outside of it. Well, perhaps there needs to be a bridge between you and a major city that you're in, that's close by to you, that is experiencing racial tension, but also then going home to where you are and saying, wait a minute, we're not experiencing racial tension because we're not willing to have the conversation here. I want to start the conversation. All of that is so important. Being someone who's worked in politics, I absolutely do believe not only is who you vote important, but that you vote is important. So often people will say, oh, okay, I'm just going to vote for the president. That's important to me this year. But you know what else is important to me? It's important to me that the judges that are being elected, the prosecutor. What do you know about them? What do they stand for? Are they the ones that are part of, we're pushing forward this war against crime? Well, who is that going to impact, right? So really having some deep conversations, work around awareness, but really being committed to these are things that I need to be responsible for, both as a citizen, but also as someone who really wants to be a part of the change.
You have to find that place in yourself where you go, ooh, that kind of hurt and that kind of stung. And that's me having to recognize something in myself that I maybe didn't even want to acknowledge was there.
One of the things that I find so much is people are so afraid of feeling uncomfortable, right? Even it's even worse than thinking they're going to say something wrong or making a mistake. Oftentimes, and I see this with white people as it relates to race. I see this with cisgendered men as it relates to sexism. And you can just go down the line that we don't want to be uncomfortable. And there is a confrontation, right, within ourselves that happens when we realize, wow, I may have had a difficult life, right? This is not that white people have never had difficult lives or men don't have difficult lives, but your life was not made difficult because of your race. Your life was not made difficult because of your gender. And so there's this reckoning that we have to do. And folks are so uncomfortable. But what I like to tell people is after that, like when we bridge that discomfort, there's so much more freedom. You can be so much clearer. Like, this is not just at the benefit or at the behest of people of color that this work is important. I want everyone to live in a society where we can know, like, hey, when I earned something, it was because of merit, not because I was lucky because of what my identity is, right? We talk so much about merit, but actually our society is really based upon luck and pretty bad odds for some people. Wouldn't it be great if we all lived in a society where we could say, you know what, actually, we are equitable and I deserve all the things that I have, instead of this guilt that I hear people talk about, like, well, what am I supposed to do with the privilege that I have? Well, right now, that's the reality. Privilege is the reality. There's so much one can do with it. Part of it is examining it. Part of it is actually, pushing some of it away and giving some of that up. And a part of it is also using privilege that we're not able to kind of shun away for the benefit of the society that we live in.
Okay, so you said something that I think I would love to hear your opinion on. I think when a lot of people who have never talked about these issues, be they white, be they men, be they whoever, they find those uncomfortable places and they freeze and they go, I just don't know what to say. I think that this spring, when George Floyd was murdered, a lot of people just said, I just don't know what to say to my black friend. Like, I know I should say something. What can people say or do, or how do they exude a presence without words that says, I see you, I hear you, I support you, I don't know what it's like to be you, but I'm here to listen? What can we do just to be a part of the conversation when starting that conversation feels like it has so much inertia it will never get going?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a part of that freeze is is just how humans respond to shock and stimuli, right? So a lot of the freeze around George Floyd was an awakening moment for people. Oh my gosh, this is really happening. I just watched this 8 minutes. Like, what in the world just happened? I can't believe it. And then a part of the shock and not knowing what to say is, well, how do I say to people who have been living this life, who've had this fear? George Floyd, we know, is not the first high profile case of a Black man being killed by the police, right? And so there's this.
Or the third or the fourth or the 10th or the
fourth,
50th.
right? Exactly.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, so there's a shame too that I think many people have expressed to me. They feel ashamed. Like, how do I go to my friends and say anything? And a part of it is some of it's discernment. Some of it's like, whoa, well, I probably shouldn't say some things because I haven't said anything before. And that's actually very it points you in a wise direction. And so this is what I say to folks. One has to examine really what they haven't said before. Because this is the first conversation you're having with your Black friend about police brutality. That's probably something you're going to want to mention up front. Like, hey, I know that I didn't recognize this before. Like, so show some self-awareness. And I am trying to figure out how I can show up as the friend I want to be, as the family member I want to be, because we have so many interracial families in our very interracial society, right? How do I show up as the employer or the boss I want to be? I'm trying to figure that out. And then maybe there's a couple steps I'm taking. So don't rely on the person to tell you what to do. You should have some steps. Maybe it's, I'm reading these books, I'm taking these classes, I am getting a coach, right? Like, that's a lot of what I do, working with groups of people who are trying to reconcile with this. I'm doing those things. I want you to know I'm here and I care and I'm listening, right? That's huge for folks. The other part that people get a little bit nervous about is the feedback. And yep, feedback will come. It may come, right? It may not come immediately, but feedback will likely come, right? I'm disappointed that you didn't realize it before. I've been wanting to talk to you. Do you remember when I told you about that story? Well, I didn't tell you the whole thing because I didn't think you'd understand. The feedback is coming, and what I always tell people, and I don't mean to be crass, but it will not kill you. It actually makes your relationships stronger to be able to hear where you may not have shown up in a way that they needed, right? Because then what is that? It feels a little like icky, but it's great information, like note to self, okay, I need to be able to show up in these ways in order to be in relationship. Because here's the thing, often you hear people say, like you said, I have a Black friend, or they'll know someone on Facebook and be like, hey, that's my one Black friend. But real relationships actually require at certain points a level of tension, right? We've all, had an argument with our parents or with our siblings or whatever. We recovered, right? We recovered. We teach our children even to do this with their friends. But as we get older, as adults, we actually begin to lack the resiliency we had as children to be able to have those tense moments and then come to repair. And that's what we need to be willing to do. And it's around all things, frankly, but around race and around issues of identity. We need to be able to have difficult conversations and then come back to repair. And a lot of folks are really ready for that.
I think a lot of people are. And if you have been holding back in speaking to someone about race, about the current moment, about the state of healthcare, about our prison systems, about our justice systems, please take Nicole's advice and just open the conversation. If you got to start with a white person that you think gets it a little bit more than you do, start there. But eventually it is critically important that we listen to people who look different than us about the experience of going through life, because it is honestly astonishing when you hear the ways that Black people are treated just in everyday life, that you take a step back as a white person, you go, wait, what? That actually happened to you? Like, wait, what? And so give yourself a moment to just accept that you may be naive on this and that is okay. Nicole, you are an absolutely brilliant woman, and it's been an honor to talk to you today. Before I let you go, can I ask you a couple of lightning round questions?
Yes, ready.
Okay, let's do this. What is your greatest strength?
Lightning round. Intuition.
What do you struggle with the most?
Life, family, work balance.
Yeah, I think a lot of women feel that.
Yeah.
Who has been your greatest inspiration?
Oh, goodness. There's been a couple. Two I want to name. Lindsey Mandela, the daughter of Nelson Mandela. She was the one when he was in prison that would read his letters out to thousands of folks that were fighting apartheid. She was a good friend. I worked with her when I was pregnant with my second daughter, and I named her Lindsey. And Lindsey Mandela passed away last week.
Oh, my stars. My condolences to you. I'm so sorry.
From coronavirus, which is impacting all over the world, and she passed away in Johannesburg.
And disproportionately impacting our Black and brown people on Earth, as does all disease, my friends. So.
Unfortunately, and often it's just because of economics and colonialism.
Absolutely.
The other person also passed away last week, and I worked with him for a number of years, and he taught me a lot about how to fight vehemently and fiercely in politics, but show a lot of love, and that's John Lewis.
Well, they were both such amazing people, and I'm glad that they touched your life personally. Yes. And, seeing John Lewis everywhere last week on so many people's Instagram feeds, and realizing there are so many people of color that white people do not even have a clue what they have done to contribute to the
Yes.
greater world around us. Because if one thing is true, it is that when one of us rises, we all as humanity rise. And so I was grateful to get to read so many impassioned, wonderful things about John Lewis last week. And so my condolences to you. Those are two huge losses in your life, but thank you for bringing them to our audience's attention today. What keeps you up at night?
Right now, it's if we as Americans have the will to do what we need to do, despite all of the challenges we have, do we have the will? Do we care enough even about ourselves in order to change the society? That's what wakes me up at night.
Whew, it's a big question. It is a big question. Last but not least, God to you is?
Oh my goodness. Well, I run a conference on politics and spirituality a couple times a year. And so God is a multi-generational, multi-being spirit that is wise enough to allow us to make our own decisions, but give like a heck of a lot of support in the background.
Absolutely.
Like a good troop of moms.
Yeah, I love that. I love I think you may be the first person on the show that has given that feminine understanding of God, because God is both. God is both masculine and God is both feminine. And so thank you for reminding us that within the divinity of the world, there is a divine feminine who is always there to care for you and love you. So everybody, please go check out www.NicoleLee, that's LEE.org, and you can find out more about diversity, about inclusion, and about equity. And if you have not done it yet, if you are a business owner and you are looking for someone to come in and give you some pointers about how you can create a more just and equitable and fair environment in your workplace, in your school place, in your place of worship, my goodness, one of the most segregated places in America today, please do look up Nicole. Nicole Lee, thank you so much for being on the Lindsey Elmore Show.
Thank you so much. It's great to talk to you.
Taking supplements is challenging, and when there are dozens and dozens of them to choose from, deciding which one to take is difficult, and determining if the combination that you chose to put together is safe and effective and meaningful is even tougher. I have a website dedicated to education about supplements and products from Young Living essential oils. And I have a free download that will ensure that you are choosing your supplements wisely, using them correctly, and not wasting money on supplements that you don't need. To get the free download, head to www.yledclub.com/safe supplements. You'll get a free downloadable book that will ensure that you have the confidence to take all of your supplements with ease. Once again, that's www.yledclub.com/safe supplements. Sometimes when I talk about healthcare disparities, it can seem like this huge foreign concept to where it's really difficult to determine what's actually going on that is making certain people sicker while other people tend to thrive. Well, health is not only about the care that we receive. There's a lot that goes into what overall makes someone able to access care and to engage with that health care in a way that is meaningful. So healthcare disparities refer to differences in the health and the health care between groups that are closely linked within social, economic, and or environmental disadvantages. So disparities occur across a lot of different people, a lot of different places, a lot of different races and ethnicities, ages, locations, gender, disability status, as well as sexual orientation. Any and all of those can put you at risk for not being able to achieve health, either on your own through your own health and wellness mission, or through engagement with the healthcare system. So healthcare and healthcare disparities are not only affecting certain groups, but it limits the overall progression of health and wellness and the status of care across everyone. That's because when people face healthcare disparities, they engage with the healthcare system at times of crises. This is not when you want to engage with the healthcare system. Ultimately, our big goal in life is to stay as healthy as we absolutely possibly can. And when we engage with the healthcare system at a time of crisis, you've got diabetic ketoacidosis, or you've had a heart attack or a motor vehicle accident after driving drunk in your car, whatever has happened, when you engage at the level of crisis, it's very expensive for the system. Unfortunately, there are not adequate systems in place for a lot of people. Approximately half of the U.S. population faces some kind of healthcare disparity. So when we think about how does this arise, where does this come from? Well, let's think about the social determinants of health. When we think about what allows us to live healthier lives on our own, engage with the healthcare system at a very senior level where we get to see the practitioner that we want in the time that we want, we can pay the copays on the insurance. We have insurance to begin with, friends. It gives us the opportunity to have elective surgeries, to say, you know what, my hip hurts. I want a hip replacement. Those types of things bear into social determinants of health. So what are these social determinants? Number one, economic stability. Number two, neighborhood and physical environment. Number three, education. Number four, food. Number five, community and social context. Number six is the health care system. So economic stability means, do you have a job? Do you have an income that you can rely on? Do you have debt? Do you have so many expenses? Has your life been crushed with medical bills? Do you have support to pay for the care that you need? And it's not just the care that you need. When you really take a look at healthcare disparities, it's one of those things. Do you have the bus fare to get to the hospital? If you can't walk to the hospital, do you have the bus fare to get to that doctor's appointment, to go to the dentist so that your teeth are cleaned before you end up needing a root canal? Those are economic stabilities. Neighborhood and physical environment. Do you live in a safe house? You think about healthcare disparities and, oftentimes we think it's the big stuff. No. Think about a 75-year-old man who has, he's got mild Parkinson's disease, but the physical environment of his house has very dangerous stairs out front of his home. Stairs that were perhaps built, 1910, 1920, and they're warped and they're beautiful, but they're potentially dangerous for this person. That's a disparity. That person may not have the financial stability to replace it or to build a ramp. But knowing that that is a risk means that, we can take steps to protect that person, but only if that economic stability is there. So it's almost like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When we're down here on the bottom and don't have economic stability, everything above that collapses. So housing is important. I remember I remember one time we used to do house calls when I was a postdoc, and we would go to these people's houses and you would see crazy stuff. You think you know somebody, you think you know a patient, and then you go to their home. And I would see people who were on oxygen, who had oxygen built into their walls or had large oxygen tanks. And they're walking all around their house with just oxygen tubing. That's a fall hazard, and it's a determinant of health, a social determinant of health that goes into the safety of the home environment. A lot of people, again, you don't think of healthcare disparities as something that affects you, but how many of you have had an aging parent who you had to take up area rugs out of their home so they didn't trip and fall? That is a social determinant of health that, thankfully, because you'd had a different social determinant of health, the education, you knew to do. Other things within the neighborhood and physical environment are transportation, being able to get around with ease, parks and playgrounds and community accessibility, as well as walkability. If you live somewhere where it is eminently walkable, well, you are inevitably going to walk more than you would if you lived somewhere where everywhere that you went required your car. We don't think about it much, but our zip codes matter. Our zip codes and the districting that has been done around our zip codes is also a very important social determinant of health, because that relegates where do your children go to school? How close are you to your nearest hospital, to the nearest interstate? How many fire stations do you have surrounding you? All of that plays into zip code as well as geography. The next social determinant of health is education. One of the things that's huge when I was training to become a pharmacist, and one of the things that's really helped me to craft my voice as far as how do I convey complicated science to people in understandable and meaningful language? And that goes into health literacy. And if you take a step back, health literacy directly ties to literacy in general, the ability to read and write. And most people can read and write, but there are many who cannot. And the worst thing about not being able to read and write is we have attached a social stigma to it. So a lot of patients will nod and smile as you are conveying things to them. And how many of you have been with a healthcare professional who makes you feel like you're an idiot, who just talks over your head, who uses all this complicated language? It doesn't matter what I teach you about if you don't understand it. And that is critically important. So health literacy, as well as literacy in general, is really important. Practitioners that are listening, if you have patients that do not have good health literacy or do not have literacy in general, please consult with some of your occupational therapists and get them to help. Pharmacists out there are amazing continuing education modules about how to educate patients to take medications by using color coding, as well as pictograms with charts of sun and moon and lunch and all of the things to help patients really understand what they're doing, because lack of understanding of the written language is... If you don't have good providers willing to take time with you, it can be a seemingly insurmountable obstacle within the healthcare system. So literacy is important. Language. I was blessed to train in California and learned very early in my career how to work with interpreters and work with translators, and it's such a blessing when you can speak to someone in their own language. When I trained, I remembered my first patient that came in and spoke Burmese. And one of the most amazing things about working within the University of California system was I picked up the phone and I instantly had a translator who spoke Burmese. It was astonishing. It was amazing. And it allowed me to take care of that patient on a different level. But not everyone has that. And that is what a healthcare disparity is. That is what a healthcare disparity is. If you don't have access to services like that aim to keep you healthy and well, you don't have adequate care. You don't have access to that. Early childhood education, vocational training, and higher education also play into how healthy we are. Adults who go and get their postdocs tend to be healthier for a longer time. They have better access to food. They have better access to good housing. They have better access to financial support to pay their bills, etc. The next social determinant of health is food. The first and foremost is not access to food. Access to food is important, but even more important than that is hunger. Hunger will overcome any education. It will harm any kind of vocational training that you are trying to do. It will harm your ability to take advantage of playgrounds and the walkability of your neighborhood. Hunger is, it is just that, isn't it? It's just hunger. It's an insatiable longing that I know most of us listening here today, we've never experienced true hunger. We've never experienced true hunger, but people do every single day. And it puts them in a position where their health outcomes are not as good because they're hungry. Guess what? When you hungry, you get hangry. And when you're hangry, sometimes you make bad decisions. And some bad decisions land people in jail. And that's not a good place to be. So food and access to food is very, very important. Only then beyond that is access to the healthy options. What about community? Community is so important. Social integration, support systems, community engagement, living in an area that is free from discrimination and discriminatory practices, as well as the way that we can manage stress within our environment is so important. Lastly, we have the healthcare system. And so we have to think about what coverage do we have? Do we have insurance? Is insurance affordable? Is it a thing in our lives? The next thing is provider availability. You know, if people have some sort of rare disorder that requires a specialist, but yet they don't have the bus fare to get there, or they don't have the language skills to make the appointment, or they don't have a car to drive to get there, or maybe they can't drive, but they don't have someone to drive them to that appointment. That leads to disparities in health. And so being able to find a provider in your neighborhood that is accessible as well as affordable to you is very important. Within that provider, what about the linguistic and the cultural competency? Linguistic is being able to provide support either in someone's native tongue, providing an interpreter service, or working really hard to use translation services and to be sure that you're doing the absolute best that you can to be sure that people understand the healthcare information that you're giving them. The thing about healthcare and the thing about Western medicine is you can make mistakes that are real bad, really bad. You can make really bad mistakes when it comes to healthcare. And one of those mistakes is not ensuring that the patient understands what is supposed to happen when they take a medicine, or when they go to start a new dietary routine, when they decide that they're going to switch from medicine A to medicine B. What does that mean to them? If somebody comes into the hospital and chooses program A versus program B for how to deliver their child, what does that mean? You know, how do we decide those things? So being able to provide the linguistic care of being able to provide care in their language, but the cultural competency and the respect for the person is also critical. And unfortunately, we live in societies that have discrimination, that put undue stress on certain populations. And that is simply a lack of cultural competency. It's a lack of being able to look at someone in the eyes and realize that they're a human being just like you. They deserve care. It is my belief that healthcare is a basic human right. We all deserve to be cared for, and we all deserve access to care. We also all deserve quality in our care. You know, I am a pharmacist, and I am not a jack of all trades pharmacist. I know my branch of pharmacy, but I haven't made it my life's work to be triple board certified or quadruple board certified, or to really be able to lecture in anything and everything. No, I can teach you really well, and I can manage medications really well within a very narrow population. But I tell you what, if I were the only pharmacist in your tiny town and I was the only one that was there, even if I didn't know exactly what your rare cancer of some random part of your eye that I've never heard of is, my goal would always be to treat you with the same care that I would want to receive. Care that is empathetic, that understands that sometimes the person in front of me who looks like they're such a bonehead, why can't they just behave like they're supposed to? Stop drinking the soda, drink the water instead. If I can realize that not everything that person is doing is directly because of things that were in their control. Oftentimes, things that govern our health are completely out of our control. We have no control over the financial state that we were born into, whether or not we received early childhood education, if we went hungry as a child. We didn't have control over whether we had the most amazing specialist in our neighborhood. But I do pride myself that no matter who is in front of me, I will care for them to the greatest of my ability. And I will do what I can to mitigate these social determinants of health. That ultimately, if I don't aim to mitigate social determinants of health, I have a direct impact on the likelihood that this person suffers, that they live a shorter life, that they have an early mortality, that they spend more money than they have to, that they just don't live as a vibrant and as well a life as all humans deserve. That's what I want to do. People struggle to talk about this. Nobody wants to talk about how some people get the short end of the stick. What I have learned in my life is that when I finally do look at who gets the short end of the stick and what can I do about it, because dang it, I drew the long straw. I had it pretty dang good growing up. Sure, I had some stress. I went through some stuff. I had some things that happened, but ultimately, I know that by acknowledging, wow, I've been so blessed in ways that not everyone is. It allows me to maintain my oath of being a pharmacist that I hold very dear. I promised to devote myself to a lifetime of service to others in the profession of pharmacy. In fulfilling this vow, I promised to consider the welfare of humanity and the relief of suffering my primary concerns. if it takes me having a little bit of an awkward conversation about how some people didn't get it as good as others, and I have to get a little uncomfortable with that and feel that in my heart and soul, good. That puts me on the path to helping to see humans as humans and contributing to humanity in the best way that I know how. You too can do this. You can. Just start to look at the world around you and question and ask and observe. And most importantly, listen. Listen to other people's stories. The more that we listen, the more that we learn that people who are different than us have a sacred humanity that we all share. The Lindsey Elmore Show is written and produced by me, Lindsey Elmore. Show segments are produced by Sue Procco and Kelsey Lorman. Production design, sound design, and editing is by Jive Media. If you have a question about this or any other episode of the podcast, send us an email to hello@lindseyelmoreshow.com. And hey, since you're still here, take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And while you're at it, go over and follow us on Instagram @Lindsey Elmore Show. This helps us bring the pod to more people.